Hello, my name is Dr Ursula Hackett and I'm an academic based at Royal Holloway, University of London. I created these videos for ambitious students who want to write brilliantly, not just okay. This video is the third of 3 about examining the assumptions underlying a question. The words we've considered up to now have been fairly obvious flags for underlying assumptions, but there are many other words that indicate hidden assumptions which are far more ubiquitous in essay questions and also harder to spot because they're very small and common. These words are but and or. You're bound to encounter these in essay questions at some point. If I say, Zoe is here, but she isn't happy, I'm making not one, but 2 surface statements. Zoe is here, and Zoe isn't happy. But the word but indicates an assumption hiding beneath. But implies that there is a tension between these 2 statements. If I'd use the neutral connective and, that implicature disappears. The assumption is, generally, people who are here are happy. Whenever you see the word but in an essay question, the question is assuming that the 2 clauses are in tension with one another. An ordinary essay glosses over this small distinction. A brilliant one considers it explicitly. For instance, man exists in a world created for God's purposes, but governments are created by men. Discuss this view of John Locke's theological position. The use of the word but in this statement implies that there is a tension between the idea that God's purposes animate the world and the idea that governments are created by men. That tension must be resolved somehow. A weaker essay simply describes Locke's position. A stronger one might consider how Locke and his interlocutors set up this tension, whether there is indeed a real tension, and if there is, how these 2 clauses might be reconciled. A small word that appears even more frequently than but is the word or, and this little fragment has several different meanings. The word or in English is used in both inclusive and exclusive ways. An inclusive or is really A or B or both. An exclusive or is A or B, but not both. We would say in the latter case that the 2 options are mutually exclusive. Context matters a great deal. For instance, imagine that you and your great friend Emma meet for a bite to eat at a local cafe. The waitress says, "Your tea comes with biscuit or cake." Instinctively, you know that this is an exclusive or, particularly if the waitress puts the emphasis on the word or. You can't have both biscuit and cake with your tea, only one of them. If you want both, then you'll have to pay extra. Back in Emma's flat, however, the statement biscuit or cake has a more inclusive feel. If Emma's baking is particularly good, or you're feeling particularly greedy, then you might feel comfortable responding, "Both, please." The inclusive or is roomy enough to include and. Whenever you see the word or in an essay question, try adding or both, then but not both afterwards, and consider which phrase sounds more plausible. In addition to the assumption of mutual exclusivity, that the answer cannot be both, there is a further assumption embedded in many uses of the word or, the assumption that the answer has to come from the options laid down on the table, and not something else entirely. We call this assumption collective exhaustiveness. Collective exhaustiveness is the concept that the available options jointly exhaust all of the possibilities. The numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 collectively exhaust the possible outcomes of a single throw of an ordinary dice. The waitress who made the statement in the cafe would be surprised if you asked for, say, a hot dog with your tea, when she's already laid out what we assume to be collectively exhaustive options, biscuit or cake and nothing else. Imagine being asked, "Is archaeology fun or tedious?" You might take issue with the assumption that the answer is definitely one or the other and nothing else. The question is nudging you to choose one of these options and go all in on that side and that side only. A weaker essay would simply follow that nudge. A brilliant essay would question it. A clever way to interrogate this question would be to consider whether the question is a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is a distinction between 2 alternatives where the choice is not mutually exclusive, the answer can be a bit of both, and not collectively exhaustive. There are other possibilities that have not been presented. Many essay questions ask students to choose between two or more options, and they tend to carry the assumptions of mutual exclusivity and collective exhaustiveness. For example, is David Hume a skeptic or a naturalist? Was the Obama administration's foreign policy a continuation of or a break with his predecessors? Were the Aztecs an empire or merely a hegemony? Which is the most powerful institution in the European Union? The Council, the Commission, or the European Parliament? Sometimes a full-throated endorsement of one side or the other is warranted, in line with the assumptions of mutual exclusivity and collective exhaustiveness. But other times, nuance is needed. Perhaps Hume is both skeptic and naturalist. Obama shared Bush's commitment to regime change in the Middle East, yet took a more measured approach than his predecessor. Aztec rule involved political control but little homogenisation. And the European Court of Justice, or the European Central Bank, which the statement did not even mention, might have legitimate claims upon the title of most powerful institution in the European Union. The most common word you will come across in essay questions is why, and this word always carries an implicature. Asking why X implies that X is indeed the case. Since your tutor set the question and asked you why X in good faith, it's unlikely that X will be outright false, but it may not be true without qualification. For instance, why is utilitarianism such an influential moral theory? Why does resource wealth harm economic growth? Why did the peace process in Afghanistan fail? Why are third parties so weak in the United States? These questions contain the following implicatures. Utilitarianism is a very influential moral theory. Resource wealth harms economic growth. The Afghan peace process failed. Third parties are very weak in the United States. None of these assumptions are obviously false. Indeed, they all seem plausible, but they may not be true under every circumstance or time period, or for every specification of the most ambiguous part of each question: influential, harm, fail, and weak. Other moral theories may be more influential than utilitarianism, particularly in non-Western cultures. The resource curse is a blight, but Norway and Botswana seem to have escaped it. The ongoing Afghan peace process involves both challenges and successes. When historian Richard Hofstadter claimed that third parties are like bees, once they have stung, they die, he did at least acknowledge that third parties have strength in their sting, since their temporary existence prompts changes to mainstream parties' policy commitments. Instead of simply riffing off a list of reasons why utilitarianism is influential, resource wealth harms growth, the peace process failed, and third parties are weak, a wise strategy is to first consider whether these assumptions are indeed true. If they are only partly true, or true under certain circumstances or for some specification of the question, then you should say so. Sometimes it's a how or a what or a when question. How should we account for the failure of James Lovelock's Gaia theory? Don't just start riffing off reasons for failure. First, consider whether the assumption is true, that the theory does indeed fail. What price does the United States pay for its exceptionalism? Again, don't just start listing prices. First, consider whether America is indeed exceptional. When does urban sprawl benefit minority neighbourhoods? Don't just list the circumstances. First, consider whether the assumption is true, that urban sprawl does actually benefit minority neighbourhoods. Sometimes there's no assumption. Why did the Civil War occur in England and Normandy between 1135 and 1153? Why do cabinet ministers resign? Well, civil war did occur in England and Normandy between 1135 and 1153, and cabinet ministers do sometimes resign. I'm not saying that there's always an assumption underlying a question, but it's good to be alive to the possibility because it helps you to pick the question apart and think about it critically, to really read the question. And these are the characteristics of truly brilliant essays. Thanks for watching this video. If you found it useful, please like the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you can find other videos to help you write truly brilliant essays.